Before we get started and let everyone join. Good afternoon, all. We'll get started now in a moment or two. Okay, it looks like everything's connected up and we are live. So good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, wherever you are. Thanks very much for joining. My name is Conor O'Neill. I'm head of product here in NearForm. I'd like to welcome you to Decoded. So this is a web series we've been doing for a couple of months now, and we're just kind of putting technology into context. We're looking at real life challenges in software development and everything around software development. And we hope you find it useful. A few little bits of housekeeping for today. You know, as always on webinars like this, everybody but us is muted, but we do actually want to hear from you. So, you know, go to that Q&A button down the bottom at any point throughout the webinar, pop your questions in there. We give a couple of minutes at the end to answer them. If we think of it, we'll try and answer them during. What my guess is we'll answer them at the end. Just so you're aware, this is being recorded and will be available later for obviously for playback. But it's also being live streamed on YouTube and ideally live streamed on LinkedIn as well. So today we're talking about cloud infrastructure, and as you can tell from the title, we're looking at how you can get to that situation where you can possibly deploy on the first day of your project. But is that reasonable? And if you can do it, how do you do it? So I'm not going to answer that. I've got two people here who hopefully will. We have McDonnell, who's one of our technical directors, and Petr, Kohut, who's a senior DevOps engineer here in NearForm. So lads, great to have you here.
Well, Conor, how are we? Hello, audience.
We're all good. Let's dig in. Let's get started. I know we have a lot to talk about and a lot to cover, and I don't want us to run over like we do every single time. So this time we're definitely going to run over again. So let's start off. We'll talk about what my kids call the olden days, or what we called a couple of years ago. And I suppose we went from provisioning on actual hardware, like real boxes, real metal, to provisioning on VMs, to spinning up Kubernetes clusters, and we thought then, right, all of the issues around kind of getting speedy deployment have been solved. Dean, can you give us or talk a little bit about where a lot of organizations are really at, and why maybe they're actually in the classic trough of disillusionment or pit of despair, to make it easier for both of us to refer to it as. What were they expecting and what do they actually have right now?
Yeah, so it's interesting that all the pieces you mentioned they're all places we deploy to, right? They're the end target, as opposed to the thing you deploy with, the pipeline, etc. And I think when people find themselves in the trough of disillusionment or the pit of despair, yes, I got the vote right. I think when they're in there, what they're really feeling is problems around the actual pipeline and the quantity of things that they're trying to either deploy or manage or maintain. So yes, we did get much faster and much easier going from VMs all the way up to cloud, and in some cases functions, right? You can now just deploy functions on most big clouds. But in reality, I mean, the problems they're facing haven't gone away. It's still hard to do the deployment, right? Or it's hard to do it in a way that's repeatable and easy and isn't ballooned out into a bunch of kind of interconnected processes.
Gotcha. So to use that classic line you're saying, it's the journey, not the destination.
Agreed.
This is where the challenge is. So Petr, look, we've built a lot of systems for deploying software over the years, and you've seen various tooling trends come and go, stuff that was hot isn't anymore. And I think later we'll be talking a little bit about kind of pull versus push being one of the more recent ones. But just to give people, I guess, a sense of NearForm's history, can you give me just some sort of ballpark on the number of systems we've deployed in recent times using what you consider your preferred approaches?
Yeah, I think it's about like 50 plus projects where we used like, let's call it like modern tools and methods. And this of course applies mainly to greenfield projects, right? But even when we are on a brownfield one, we follow our standards, right? So I think we may say that we've done this enough times to have an opinion on it.
I like that. You know, we have an informed opinion. It's not something we read on that internet. Dean, you know, is it fair to say we've made all these mistakes? So
absolutely not.
Our customer, we've never made mistakes.
Never. Every time, Connor, 100%. No, I'm kidding. Of course, I'm kidding. Yeah, look, we have absolutely made mistakes, and I suppose, look, what we're talking about today is I suppose us trying to codify some of those mistakes so that others can avoid them and that we can avoid them again in the future. But I suppose it's unfair to call them mistakes, right? They're more learnings, and it's because deployment is like super easy on a whiteboard, right? You just draw a couple of lines and connect them together, boom, deployed. But in reality, deployment is actually tricky because it's on a per customer basis. It's got little nuances that the business need, and there's loads of little itty bitty bits that just don't get translated from the plan to real life. So I think what we've always tried to kind of focus on is when you find those nuances, can you kind of, you know, codify quality in and around them, I think.
Gotcha. And I, you know, even from talking to you over the years and talking to other DevOps people in NearForm, I do get the sense that there's a lot of companies sort of, they have this enterprise Java architect view of getting a system deployed. You know, we're going to need a bigger boat. Huge architectures, huge complexities, and then this sort of thing of nothing works until all the bits work. Is that something you're still running into, like after all?
Yes, and look, some of my best friends are Java enterprise architects. You know, good people all around. But I do get what you're saying, and there's definitely a case of still the architect making something based on you know, the boxes and the arrows and kind of just building something out that's super complex and kind of handles every need. And in reality, you should really be doing your kind of pipelines and your DevOps deployments about the same size as whatever it is you're trying to deploy. So let's assume you're trying to deploy an MVP. Well, then you should have scoped deployment pipelines to handle just the MVP, not what the MVP will be in 5 years, you know. And this is the mistake, you know, a lot of boxes and arrows allows you to add complexity and add kind of functionality, but it doesn't really capture the real cost, right? So you tend to kind of, you end up with bigger systems that feel more secure, right? Because it's got a lot of things in it. But in reality, you're not trying to create a situation where you're making small, less secure things. You're trying to just do enough scope in a secure and quality manner for what you need right now, not for what you might need in the future. You can worry about that in the future when you have that need.
Okay, yeah, because it's funny you say that, because you know, MVP is always thought of in terms of the software you're building. So it's interesting to see that language used around kind of, you know, DevOps and kind of doing just enough, you know, for right now. And Petr, I don't want to use the phrase, what are the philosophical positions that you take when you're putting one of these together? That's a bit heavy, given it's Thursday afternoon. I hope it's nice. Thursday afternoon. So let bring it down a little bit. How do you avoid that sort of analysis paralysis and actually get software delivery happen?
Yeah, I think it's important to, for example, to have a live environment or working environment as soon as possible, right? Because the fact is that the problems usually emerge once you deploy your system, and sooner you have it, sooner you get a feedback, right? So, and I think, or we believe that it's extremely risky for a client and also for us to not have a working environment in early stage of the project.
That's it's funny because, you know, that isn't the traditional view. It's, you know, as we've been saying, you get everything figured out and then you do the deployment. But, you know, if you're going to spend months architecting one of these systems, you may effectively be inflicting it on the team. Like, it may not be appropriate for where they are in the kind of the development lifecycle. And, you know, again, we all know this sort of sunk work, when we put all this work in, you know, we're going to bloody use this one way or another. And you know, we talk about Occam's razor as, sorry, as well, but, you know, again, I don't know why I'm going so heavy with the philosophical stuff, but, you know, is it, could we call it bottom up transformation, Dean? Or?
Yeah, so like, look, I don't like to over egg it. For me, it's not so much philosophy as practical sense, right? It's what we're trying to get people to understand is that in the same way that it didn't work to build MVPs by building everything and then putting it together at the last minute, it also doesn't make sense to do your deployment and your kind of your DevOps functionality in that way as well. So, I mean, for us, I think it has really shown that when you kind of slim down what you're doing to exactly what I need for the MVP, and I do want to kind of stress that we have backlogs, etc. Right? There's still work that needs to be done that we need to plan, but instead of the DevOps team disappearing into a deep dark hole for months and months on end, and then coming out with what they think is their best idea for it without interfacing with reality and what is really needed, you never end up with an easy solution. You end up with what you said, something that's inflicted, accidental or not, something that's inflicted on the team. So for me, like, I really do like to kind of keep it simple and just say, you know, this is what we need right now. It needs to be of this quality and it needs to be this secure, and get that and focus on that. And then we can grow that as we go with the team in an environment where it's going to be used, right? And maybe to Peter's point, the point here is to get deployed up front, because that's really where you're going to get the trickiness and the edges, is once it's out and deployed and live and things like that. So you want to get to that period as quick as possible, because being there in the first kind of week or two or first sprint, you really end up in a situation where you've got all this extra time to test a production deployment. Whereas traditionally, as you know, Connor, we test production a week before it goes live and hope we have enough time for it, you know. So
Friday afternoon.
Yeah. So I think it's just easier to focus on what you need right now and then build up as you go. And instead of going big bang and deploying later, go really small, quality up front, and deploy now and then build up while you're in production, essentially. It's not real production, right? You'll still have a situation where it's just you, POs, and stakeholders, but for all intents and purposes, it's running in a production context, right? That's the important piece. Is all the extra bits that are needed to get it into a production environment are all there. So it's real production, but not necessarily, you don't have to give it out to clients day one as such.
There was an important word you dropped in there, which is quality.
Loads of important words.
I know, but it is, because you're not telling me just lobbing something out and, you know, it's all tied together with string. So security, Petr, I mean, just on that topic, what are we talking about?
I wanted to say I agree with everything what Dean said, and regarding the security, I just want to make sure that our listeners don't think that we sacrifice security, right? Because that's not true. It's just that we don't aim to have an ultimate security from day one. So as an example, we may say that we use the secret management, right? But we don't implement the secret rotation at the beginning of the project, because that just is not important at the time.
Yeah, gotcha.
I do think that's a good example of a practical use case, right? You're not slicing things off. You're layering on complexity as you need it, rather than kind of saying, I'm just going to not do any of this. I'm going to do just enough. And then as you need it, you layer on more.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I suppose on these decoded sessions to date, we talk about these accelerators that we've built in various aspects of software development and application development. So let's dig in, I suppose, to the one that's relevant here, which is what we call Taurus. And, you know, for the audience, particularly if there's anybody new on this, this isn't us doing we're not doing a product pitch here. This isn't a shrink-wrapped tool that we want you to go buy or anything like that. This is something we have built that enables us to deliver for our customers, and, you know, we make it available. So, like, you know, I suppose to just get people kind of into the headspace of it, Dean, can you give us at a very, very high level what it's all about?
Yeah, so look, ultimately it's a little toolkit, and it's a repeatable model for deploying things on GCP, AWS, Azure, and that's because that's where our clients live, right, on the three big clouds. It focuses on good quality as a starting point. So, you'll see things in there like secret management is handled up front, because we think that's something you should bring in up front and not try and bolt on later. But in general, it bakes in a lot of kind of cloud first technologies. So if you go to, say, you go to AWS, there's a bunch of technologies that enable you to deploy quite easy by, like, I suppose I'm trying to get to like cloud databases, etc. There's a bunch of stuff that's already in the cloud, and if you go to each cloud, there's an equivalent technology for it. So we try and make use of that cloud first principle. But I think, not to over-egg it, it is essentially just a little toolkit for making deployments easily, and a really good first step in terms of getting things up and onto the cloud.
Okay.
Peter will do a better job. I butchered
that. Yeah, well, I suppose on a better. So I suppose talking about two aspects. What are the major components of this thing that Gene has just butchered, and what were some of the specific technology choices then that you made for those components as you get today?
I'm gonna let Peter answer that one.
Yeah. So if I may start from the second question, I think that we did like three major choices. One was that we wanted to just provision the sensible defaults, right? So basically components which we believe each project usually have. The second one was that we wanted to use only managed services if possible. And by saying managed services, I mean managed by cloud. So we don't need to manage them in either client. And the third one was that we must follow all security best practices on every single component. And regarding the list of the components, so basically the Taurus is built of managed Kubernetes, managed database, managed certificates, DNS, logging, metrics. We have essential Kubernetes add-ons like ingress controller, etc. And there is also like example of CI/CD pipeline for any workload which will run on the cluster. So that's pretty much it.
Okay. Now I'm getting a handle on it. I do like that idea of sensible defaults. It's an eminently sensible approach. Dean, are there any other interesting aspects for you about what it's all about?
Yeah, I suppose I'd like to call out that managed bit, or maybe try and unbreak that. I think, to your point, using managed services is essential, a sensible approach, right? It's something that we think is a good way to kick off on projects. And if you want to go specialized managing things, go for it. But otherwise, we have found that for production context, each of the clouds have equivalent services that map to managed services, right? So we feel that's a big win. And it reduces the complexity on the client side, right? So that's always a good thing, is less complexity for the client to manage. I think that's a really interesting kind of piece in it. And then look, fundamentally, it's Kubernetes, Helm, GitHub Actions, Terraform. So I mean, you could argue it's conservative, right? If you talk to some DevOps folks, right, considering what's in there and considering what's out. But I suppose what's interesting in and of itself is how little is there, and how much of it is just giving you a good head start.
Okay, so it sounds just like a bunch of scripts to me, to be fair. Like I could probably batch that together in a weekend, could I?
I think you could, Connor. Connor, I think you could. You specifically, Connor.
I probably could.
Look, I'm not going to come on here and tell you that it's not just a bunch of scripts. It is absolutely just a bunch of scripts. And I suppose that's the point me and Peter are trying to make to people, and our DevOps team constantly tries to make to folks, is it turns out to get good quality deployment, you only need a bunch of scripts. So you don't need like repositories and repositories worth of configuration and big tools to sort all this out. You can do it very well, very neat, very tidy with a bunch of scripts. So in general, like, this is a lesson we had to learn, right? Because we started, when Taurus started, it was far bigger. We did what everybody else did. I'm letting the cat out now, Connor. We did what everybody else did, and we built the big monster, and it did everything, and it did it in 7 different ways. And it was a maintenance nightmare for us. Before you even bring it into a client, it was a maintenance nightmare. So if you peek back far enough in the GitHub in the kind of in the repositories, you'll see the old style, right? If you look deep enough, you'll find it and you'll kind of chuckle to yourself. But the lessons learned we had was we aggressively reduced the scope, and then we ended up with a bunch of scripts, and it just happens to be very, very useful scripts that allow us to tie things together in a good quality manner.
Yeah, just to add, no, that's exactly right. Yeah, I think it's like 2 years back when the stack was way much bigger, and it was just too opinionated, to be honest, which we basically find out very, very quickly on the next project. So we, as Dean said, we had to reduce the scope, and I think now it's it's much more useful.
Well, that's you know, I knowing that history is important, because
we prefer to sweep it under the rug, Connor. We prefer, as I said, we want to pretend that we did it right the first time. Yeah.
Well, gotcha. Yeah, absolute perfection from the start. But like, you know, with any project, there's always this pressure to just keep adding features. And
yes.
I can't believe I'm quoting, you know, for us old folks, Zawinski's law. It says that every program attempts to expand until it can read email. So, you know, is that?
And can we, Peter? Do we have an email module right now in Taurus? I don't think we do just yet, do we? No. I know we can kick that off pretty simple. Yeah.
But from that point of view, from that sort of people constantly wanting more features, what is the actual plan?
Yeah, so I would say, joking aside, Taurus is conceptually complete in that I think it really now hits the sweet spot of how much is useful up front versus like when does that start to tip over into I have to delete things or I have to configure things for you know, half a day, etc. Because that's where it starts not becoming useful. It starts to become inflicted, as you said, as opposed to brought in. So the reality is for us, we needed something that would allow us to get started, but still kind of allow us to make nuanced changes from a customer to customer basis. And in that instance, I think the fundamentals won't change of what's there, but what may change is some of the tech, etc. Because DevOps people like to change tech all the time. So I'm sure Peter has an endless list of things he would like to do, but I don't think the core of what it's trying to achieve is going to change at this stage.
Got it. And actually, to Dean's point, you know, are there interesting pieces of tech you're looking at which in the future might be appropriate for Taurus?
There are two, but one which is like partially integrated in Taurus already. There are like two things which we evaluate and play with, and those are like Kubernetes add-ons management over GitOps, which is basically a pull approach. So instead of pushing your application or add-ons or any workloads or anything on a cluster, instead of that, you pulling it from inside of the cluster. So that there are like many tools which provides you with this approach, and one is called Flux, another one is called Argo CD. And yeah, so this is something we played with a lot, and even the Taurus GCP version has implementation of this for managing Kubernetes add-ons, and the second one is the infrastructure provisioning, because now the Taurus is using Terraform, which is commonly known and used tool for provisioning infrastructure. But there are also other approaches, right? You can provision infrastructure from inside of the cluster via some operators. There are like many tools which does that. I don't think that any of them are mature enough currently, but we still like follow these changes, and yeah, we are keeping an eye on it. So
yeah. Maybe to call out there, Connor, that we essentially have a DevOps practice in NearForm, right? So opinions on this stuff run thick and heavy. So Peter's kind of trained there. There's a lot of checking for maturity, etc. Because you're asking people to use this in their projects, and these people, they can smell when it might cause any issues, you know. So there's definitely a lot of trial and error goes into what actually ends up in. I did want to, before we jump on, I seen a related question because I was checking the questions, even though I was told not to. But I thought it was a very interesting question because it relates to what we're talking about here, which is, will it always be Kubernetes or in the future? Because it's a question that comes up all the time, right? So thank you, question asker. So I'm going to give you an interesting take on that, right? there are new services coming to clouds that a lot of people see, right? And they're like easy run services. So Google has Google Cloud Run, you have AWS Fargate, and you have a lot of these services that kind of are even more managed than managed Kubernetes, like managed Kubernetes. We are exploring that because we have used it on a couple of different projects to great success. There are limitations though where you end up needing Kubernetes at some stage in the process when complexity increases. But to the point of, are we going to implement something like that in Taurus? Perhaps. It really depends on kind of whether these services become a bit more mature or not, right? So it relates to what Peter is saying is, if it turns out there is another Kubernetes out there that gets as famous or as popular or a service similar to it, we will absolutely explore it, because at the end of the day, it's to try and get something that helps people. And if everybody moves off Kubernetes onto something new, we will follow that trail.
It's a very important
can I just, before we go, your light is like shining like crazy.
Oh gosh, you're right.
Yeah, what is that?
No, it's not a light. It's this thing called the sun.
And did you bottle it and bring it to your room, Connor?
It's somehow coming in under
I love that,
shade
actually.
there. Yeah, sorry. Apologies for that, everyone.
Okay.
And I have a whole thing here stopping the actual light from glaring, and of course the giant ball of fire in the sky.
It makes you look radiant, Connor. Radiant.
Radiant. Yeah. Thanks for that. And now I've completely lost my train of thought. But yeah, no, it was around, and it's a thread, I suppose, throughout the entire, not just this Decoded, but a lot of the others, that this isn't a race to pick the absolute best piece of hot technology right now. This is about finding appropriate tools that also, and I think that, you know, personally, just from seeing how things have evolved over the past few years, and it's a question for you, that being the best piece of tech is irrelevant if no one's using it.
Agreed.
An ecosystem around it.
Yeah. Yeah, if you can't convince your security team to use it, there's no point playing with it. You know, so a lot of these technologies they're things that are well used and well tested, and yes, some of them can be a bit boring, but there is newer things like GitHub Actions in there which have started to hit a maturity level that you can start using them for production. You know, but there's a lot of things that we'd really like to use, but they're just not there yet, right? They're too hot, or they're too new, or they're going to go through a period of change. Like a lot of our folks will be really they'd be checking in on these services, etc. And you kind of get a bit of a vision for some of them are going to, you know, change what they're doing or change the way they're doing it as they mature as well. And we have to be a bit conscious of that too. So if you have a situation where you're banking on one CD or one kind of particular tool and they change direction themselves, that can cause issues downstream because we've banked on the way it used to work before. So yeah, you got to keep away from the hottest stuff, unfortunately, if you want to be practical.
No, it makes complete sense. There's more questions coming in, which we'll get to in a few minutes. But if people, or can they play with this? Like if they actually wanted to go and play around with Taurus, Petr, you know, what would you say for them to do?
Yeah, I think the easiest way to get started would be on GCP version of Taurus, and I think you might find this version interesting also because of there is this GitOps approach of installation of Kubernetes add-ons. So it's not like you're not enforced to use it, but you can use it. It's described there very well and well prepared. So yeah, I think this would be easiest one. Also because of the GCP cloud is a little bit easier for manage than AWS. If that's my opinion, but yeah.
I would agree, especially if you're a dev watching this and you're thinking, you know, I wouldn't mind playing around with that and see, can I use it? I think GCP gives you the easier onboarding experience. But then look, if you're an AWS person and you know all that, go with the AWS one. It'll be familiar and it'll have all the things that make sense to you. For sure.
Okay, well, that sounds cool.
I presume there's links gone in to where they all are, right?
I think Colleen is popping the links in as we speak. And you know, usually on Decoded, I ask the guests to give a tip or a thought or a some sort of takeaway to get them maybe on this trip or this journey to being able to deploy on day one. Dean, do you have something you want to share with people?
Come join NearForm and you can do it now. No, it is.
We are. Are we hiring?
I believe we are hiring, just a little bit, just a little bit. So, so come work for us. Yeah. So I have some tips. I think realistically, what you really want to do is you want to focus on getting things deployed, right? No matter what you take out of this, if all you take is that when you go into a meeting and people start to diverge and go off in different directions, you try and bring it back and say, can we just focus on getting something deployed? Right, we'll fix it later, we'll make it brilliant later, just focus, because once something is deployed, you have something to coalesce around, you know. So and if you're worried that people are saying, oh, but production, I would then say, okay, well, let's get something to deploy to dev, and then once that's done, something deployed to staging, and then after that, something deployed to production, so that you can bring up the quality and ramp it up each time. If you do it that way, you will get deployed overall much quicker, and you will have more time in the state where things are going to break, which is kind of between QA and between staging and production. And that's ultimately what you're trying to get to. If you don't take anything from this, even if you use your own technologies, focus on that deployment piece first, and most of this will fall into place for you.
Okay, I'm going to state that word coalesce. I'm going to reuse that. I'm going to steal that one because it's
it's a nice one.
Excellent.
That took ages to come up with.
Yeah, that's great. And Petr, for you, what would be a takeaway?
I would basically say the same thing as Dean said. Just in other words, I think it's about to change our mind in terms of how we approach projects, right? So it's important to. It's not important to. It's the deployment target is not important, right? What is important is to get deployed your application as soon as possible, and have the environment where you can see it actually, right? So yeah.
Yeah, no, I like that a lot. Okay, we have a couple of questions. One, which is a bit odd, but anyway, the jobs page doesn't have any ads on it. We need to check that out.
The jobs page should have ads. Thank you very much for raising that.
Whoever's posted that, thank you, because
there absolutely should be.
Yeah.
Go annoy the Twitter people. They'll fix it for you.
Ad blocker? I don't know what might be causing that.
Could be ad blocker.
Could be ad blocker. So thank you for that, anonymous attendee. Then we have one coming in on YouTube. Philip O'Brien is wondering, they're deploying to self-hosted OpenStack with no managed services. What are the fundamental things to consider for early MVPs? So what are the first layers of complexity that must be considered?
Peter, I'm going to let you do the more technical answer, okay? But I think for me, like again, and it's to our last point, is the fundamental piece is to have a plan to get something deployed. And then after that plan, you can work out what extra bits you're missing, right? So, I mean, yes, there's the basic stuff like logging, because if you can't log it, you can't see it. Making sure that you're not storing keys in stupid places, because there is no point in a project where you should be putting keys in repos, for instance. So there's some basics that I think that person could learn by just going through Taurus and then replicating some of the same principles we're doing. So the management isn't important, it's just nice, right? So I think maybe focusing on as little as possible to get that deployment is what I would say again. Peter.
Yeah, and because I'm not expert on OpenStack, I think what Dean said is enough in terms of like answering this question, because I would just say the same thing. Sorry for not being.
No, it's like do that mapping, like what you talked about earlier.
And this is it, right? It doesn't matter. And maybe just to Peter's last point, the target doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether it's managed or not. What matters is that you don't go into a room with a box full of services and going to go, oh, we're going to pick this and this, and we're going to connect these by lines, and that's all going to be like, do you need all that for deployment? If you need to deploy 2 screens next week that have no login on them yet because it's not being built, do you need all this extra stuff next week? And if not, drop it and just focus on the things you need to deploy.
Exactly.
And sorry, just excuse me. There's another, I think, related question there around brownfield developments? Are there aspects of Taurus that are appropriate for brownfield as well? You mentioned brownfield earlier on, but we didn't.
Yeah, so it's an interesting point, right? Because you have to be careful with brownfield, because a lot of what people consider the brownness of brownfield is the fact that there's things that are not easy to take out, it's hard to turn brownfield into greenfield. However, what's quite interesting is if I would recommend to that person to pull their team together and say, NearForm told me roughly this will get them deployed to production through SecOps in a client, and ours is this. Like, can we move to this, or can we maybe have a conversation about why they think it's this size and we think it's this size? So I think for an explicit answer to the question, it should at the very least allow you to have a conversation about how much of your brownfield system is just there to be like security through obscurity, or to be like the big system because you need the big system, you know, and really start kind of taking inventory of what you have and what you need, you know. If you're in a situation where you're already on a cloud, maybe the next question to remove some of the brownness of it is, how much of this could I start to migrate to managed services? Because that alone would massively improve what you're trying to do.
Okay.
And look, maybe the brownfield side is okay. Not all brownfield is brown and icky, right? Some of it is just fine and done, you know.
And written in COBOL.
Our favorite friend.
Our favorite, back to COBOL again. Back to our earlier question, the nearform.com/careers should have the jobs on it. Nice. For that person who was asking. So I think we're heading towards wrapping up. So like, thanks again, Dean and Petr. This was fantastic. As always, I've taken my notes. I need to go off and learn more about GitOps for a start and push versus pull. So I hope everybody else found it as valuable as I did. We're back on again next month. We'll be talking to our internal accessibility experts, Jack Clark and Matt Obey. And this is really about that, the whole area of how accessibility is evolving and the challenges and opportunities there. It really is an important topic. And to be honest,
agree.
You don't see enough people talking about it. You don't see enough people passionate about it, and they should be. That's on the 1st of April, I think. But I can't say that for definite.
And it won't be me, Connor. It won't be me.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and thanks again, guys. And hopefully we'll talk to you all again soon.
Thank you very much, Connor. Thank you, everybody.